Hi everybody, in this video we're going to learn about the really cool parallax scrolling effect that you've seen pretty much everywhere, and we're going to learn about how to make it fast, how to make it performant, and all the good stuff that you'll probably need to know if you're going to build it for your own examples. So first of all, what is parallax scrolling? So in its most basic definition, which I pretty much stole from Wikipedia, parallax scrolling is a way of simulating depth by changing the speed at which things move. Now, the easiest way to make sense of this is you probably see parallax scrolling all the time. The easiest example is when you're driving or when you are looking outside your window. Things that are further away tend to move slowly, and things that are closer to you tend to move faster. And that difference in how fast things move kind of gives you an idea of how far away things are. And what we're going to be doing is trying to replicate some of that in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And here's an example, and here's what you'll end up creating. So here I have a page, and what you see is some text. And notice what you see as I'm scrolling the text down. The various shapes in the background, the yellow circle, the green, one is hexagon or octagon, and then the blue square, they each need to move at a different speed. And that kind of gives you the effect of your page being a little disconnected from the background, which might be, several meters behind you or much further away, kind of giving that effect that we all tend to call the parallax effect. And so what we're going to look at in the next few moments is how to kind of recreate this, and so hopefully you'll be able to create something that is probably a lot cooler than what you're currently seeing right here, which is just some weird shapes that are just moving at different speeds as you're scrolling up and down your page. All right, so and here's an example. If you want to see it on your screen, just copy this URL or type it in manually, and you'll see exactly the page that I showed you a moment ago. Now, the way this effect works is pretty simple. In a typical page, you have some content and you have some background. And I'm calling it background, but it can be it can be foreground content, as you'll see how it is implemented. And so what we're going to do though is by default, as you're scrolling a page, your content, the background, everything on it scrolls alongside with you. Now what we're going to do though is we're going to separate those things out. We're going to make it sure that your content scrolls independent of your background. So you might have your background fixed in some position, but it'll stay there independent of where you're actually scrolling your content up or down. Imagine we just kind of disconnect your page from everything else and just have them all floating side by side. And so an example of this would be, you can have one background element or multiple background elements and all be independent of each other in how they move, depending on whether you're scrolling up or down or left or right and how fast you're scrolling. So that's pretty much the basic background to how this works. And now we're going to go ahead and start writing some code. So to make it easier on you, I have some code that I've already created. You can go to codepen.io/group/pen, and that weird 6-character thing you need to copy and paste in there, and you'll get a starting point. And the starting point is nothing complex. It's basically the example you saw earlier, except you don't have the background images, and you definitely don't have the logic for making all of the parallax scrolling happen. That is something that we will do together. Now, if you don't like to use CodePen when you use a code editor, you can do so as well. My favorite code editor is Atom, so I had the exact same example you saw earlier, pasted and entered in this location. Let me actually clean up properly. And you can see the exact same content that you saw there. And nothing again is happening. All the cool stuff we'll be adding ourselves. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is just get some of the content to display in the background. Let me zoom in a bit so you can see more. And the content we're going to be adding is just going to be div elements. Your content could be anything. It could be images. It could be, it could be any combination of elements you just basically give an ID value to. But we're going to keep it simple and just stick with div elements. We're going to add a div, give an ID value of, in this case, let's call it big yellow circle to represent the big yellow circle we saw in the example. And I'm just going to close the div. So right now we're an empty div, nothing going on, and as you can expect, nothing to also see on the screen. So now let's go ahead and visualize it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a style rule, big yellow circle, and let's go ahead and give it some properties. So the first thing I'm going to do is give it a background image. Let me give it a background image property URL. And it's just an image. It's an SVG file that lives somewhere on my server. So www.group.com/images/yellow-circle.svg. Now, you don't see anything on the screen right now, mostly because there's no size for our current background. I'm going to give it a background size. Let's give it 90%. And that might get something to display on the screen. And actually, let's give it a width value. Give it 90, or actually 100 VW, using VW units, and height of 100 VW as well. And now you see our big circle displayed on the screen. Now, this is not quite the effect that we want, right? We don't want the circle to literally be taking up all the content and things you see there. We want to actually go behind everything you see. And so we'll go into the position value of fixed. And let's also set it to not repeat. We want it to only display once. These are all default background behaviors, so you'll be doing this for every single background you end up setting if you don't want it to behave the way you want to do. And give it a z index value of -10, so it actually goes behind all the content that we see here. And this means that the background position to be centered. These are all optional things. You don't have to do it, but why do something when you can make it look a little nicer with just adding a few lines of markup. And now let's just make sure that we position it appropriately so nothing is actually changing around and so on. And let's also give it like an opacity of 0.75. Alright, so we now have our background circle. And notice that as I'm scrolling up and down, the background is now currently static. And that is because of the value we added right here. So we're going to just change the position fixed to auto. This will essentially give you the behavior we saw earlier where it scrolls along with our content. It's just by setting the position to fixed that this magical ability for your content to be disconnected or disengaged from your background actually takes place. Alright, so we have our big yellow circle. Let's add a few more elements as well. Let's add all three elements that we talked about before. Let's add a div ID, and let's give this a value of blue square. And let's close this div. And we have one more div element we want to add as well. So let's give it a value of green pentagon. Div ID equals green pentagon. Okay, so it's a 5-sided square, not 6 or 8 like I mentioned in the example earlier. Counting is hard, especially when you're doing a video. So we'll just chalk that up to doing things live. And now we're going to have the equivalent markup to style these elements as well. And so for this, the easiest way to do this is this. You could type aloud the markup again, which is what you could do, or just copy and paste the big yellow circle style rule a few times. I'll just make changes to what we need to represent the blue square and the green pentagon. So I'm going to change the second instance of the blue circle we just copied. Let's call it blue square, and change the name of this file to bluesquare.svg instead of greencircle.svg. And let's see, what are some of the changes we want to make. So background size is going to be 10%. We want to be a very, very small image. And we want its position to be, instead of center, we want it to be, let's say, a little bit towards the right-hand side and towards the bottom of the page as well. Then you'll see it eventually. And this seems to be, set its z index to -20, so it's a little further behind everything. And this seems to be good. Background size is slightly different. It's kind of not seen on the screen right now, but you'll see it in a little bit. And then let's change the big yellow circle here to be, green pentagon. And just like before, we're going to make some minor changes to adjust what it looks like. So I'm going to change yellow circle at SVG to green pentagon.svg. And let's see, in this case, the background is going to be 5% and top. And we're going to set its size to be 50%. So therefore, it's not going to be quite as large as the yellow circle. And then everything else is going to be fine. We'll set the z index to be -30. So it's just like just a little behind all of the other content that we have been dealing with. Now you're probably wondering, so it's probably a much better way to refactor the CSS that I've had it here to have a more generic class value, a style rule that gives all the common values, and each of the big yellow circle, blue square, and green pentagon style rules are contain only the deltas, the differences that make the effect look the way it does. There are many ways of basically cleaning this up. It is not the most clean example, I understand, but you can do that as part of your final prep work to getting this live and in front of your users. Alright, so what we have right now is we have our three elements, big yellow circle, blue square, green pentagon, and we have it also styled. So that's the first step. And now really all that's remaining is write the JavaScript that basically makes this example actually do what it does, because there's only so much you can do in CSS, and in this case we've already done it. And now all that remains is to write some code. So at the bottom of your page, just above your body, after your closing div tag, add a script tag, opening and closing tags. And so we're going to first write the code, and then I'll walk through exactly how it works, and I'll try to explain some things as we're going along as well. So the first thing we want to do is this. We want to be able to call a function on page load that then runs continuously and then helps keep track of the current scroll position that you're currently in. And you'll see why in a few moments. So first, let's start off by listening to the page loading, window.add event listener. And the event we're going to listen to is DOM content loaded. And you could listen to the loaded event as well, but my preference is there's nothing really you gain by waiting as long as load takes to run. So scroll loop, false. So we have listening to DOM content loaded event, and once the event is overheard, we call the scroll loop event handler. Let's call the scroll loop event handler by defining it. And before that, let's define two variables. And these two variables are going to help store the current scrolling position of where you are on the page. So var x scroll position, this is for horizontally scrolling, and this is for your vertical scroll position. Var y position or y scroll position. And these two variables have been declared, and now let's go ahead and specify them to a value. So x scroll position is going to be set to window.scrollx. Now your window object contains a boatload of properties that allow you to inspect and get the values of many things that are going on in your document. One of them is your current scroll position. So the scroll x position is, or the horizontal scroll position is represented by the scroll x property, and the vertical scroll position, which for our example what we care about more, is represented by the scroll y property, which also lists off the window object. And now we're going to be using our favorite request animation frame function to call the scroll loop at around 60 times a second, or however many times your screen is actually reloading. So right now, if you look at the code we have, when our page loads, we're going to call the scroll loop function. It's an event handler for not being loaded. And this function is going to be called over and over again because request animation frame is essentially going to be calling it until this page is ultimately destroyed. So we have the scroll loop function just working. Great. But what it's not doing, though, is anything meaningful. It actually has no concept of scrolling, parallax, or whatever. It's pretty generic right now. So let's go ahead and fix that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a way of setting the position of an element on the page. And so for that, we're going to actually create a function called setTranslate. So function setTranslate. And so we have three arguments: x position, y position, and the element itself that we're currently interested in translating. And so what we're doing here is essentially setting the translate 3D transform on the various elements that you're trying to modify. So what we're going to type is going to look like this: element.style.transform. And here's where it gets a little tricky, not because it's hard, but because a lot of quotation marks you need to keep track of. So translate 3D, and let's have an open parentheses here, plus x position, plus parentheses, comma, space, plus y position, and let's make sure that we close it off properly, plus pixel, comma, 0, done. Okay, so what we're doing is this: when this particular function is called, we're going to translate 3D transform on an element. And if you don't remember, this is what this translate 3D transform looks like. In CSS it'd be transform : translate 3D, and then 0 pixels, 10 pixels, and then 0. What we're really doing is the JavaScript equivalent of this and setting it on an element directly by fiddling with the style object. All right, so now we have a function that is designed to only set the position of an element, and we have our scroll loop function that just keeps getting called over and over again while your page is loaded. All that really remains is to essentially get a call into the elements we want to scroll and modify their positions. So what we're going to do for that is use our favorite query selector functions and just reference the elements we had created earlier. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in, just to save you some time. So I created three variables. One is big yellow circle, and on that I'm saying calling document query selector and just referencing the ID value of the big yellow circle. Same for blue square, query selector, hashtag blue square, green pentagon, query selector, hashtag green pentagon. So now we have a JavaScript representation of the three div elements that we added just a few moments ago. Now here we are at the last and probably the most important step in all of this. You may think of this as just set up to game time, and the game time is this few lines of code we're going to be adding to adjust the position of our content. So inside our scroll loop, we're going to call setTranslate, and the first element we're going to modify is that setTranslate. Remember, takes three arguments: x position, y position, and element. So our X position value for this example is also going to be 0. We're not doing any horizontal scrolling at all. We're just only scrolling vertically. And the Y position is not going to be hard-coded value. It's going to be the value Y scroll position that we calculated just a few moments ago with window.scrollY. And here is where we specify the third argument to set translate, which is the element that we're actually going to be scrolling. And in this case, it's going to be big yellow circle. All right. So right now we seem like it seems like it should work, right? I'm scrolling down, and notice that you see that the big yellow circle is moving at whatever speed it is currently moving at, which is basically the speed of our scroll value itself. So that's kind of cool. Not quite what we want, but at least you can see that by scrolling the page, the circle, the background image that we have, is actually moving at a different direction. Now let's go ahead and replicate the same exact code for the two other elements that we currently have on the page. I'm just going to copy and paste the set translate method or function call and paste it in here. Let's replace the big yellow circle with blue square, and let's place the third one with green pentagon. Now I think in the browser right now, at least in the Atom code, we're not seeing the blue square, which is okay for now. But notice that as I'm scrolling up and down, the content, all of them are moving at the same speed, which is fine, but you just want to just get a sanity check to make sure that all these elements are moving separately from the content themselves. Now, here's where your own creativity and willingness to experiment with different decimal values kind of comes into play. So what we want to do is scale the speed at which our elements are actually scrolling. So right now there's no scale value applied to them, and what you need to scale them by is a very small negative number or a positive number depending on what direction you want the scrolling to be. So here's an example. So Y scroll position, right now there's no scaling going on. Let's scale it by a value of negative 0.2 for the Y scroll position for big yellow circle. And once I've done that, notice now how our blue yellow circle moves. It is no longer moving as rapidly up and down the page as it did before, but it's basically moving at a fraction of the speed it was by default. And similarly, let's go ahead and give a scaling value to the Y scroll position for blue square. Let's make this go a little faster, minus 1.5. And let's scale this one at a more reasonable, just a 0.5, moving in the opposite direction altogether. So now if I'm scrolling the page, notice that now each element is moving at a different speed, and that kind of gives you the effect of the parallax scrolling that we were trying to create from the very, very beginning. So before we wrap up, let's just walk through the code one more time. The page loads, the scroll loop event handler is called. And this event handler just runs 60 times a second, or however many times your screen is currently refreshing. And what we were doing is we have a JavaScript hook into big yellow circle, blue square, green pentagon, or any host of elements that you want to participate in all this parallax goodness. And then we're using a set translate function, which is basically specifying a translate 3D transform on the element itself and specifying the X position and Y position you want to translate the content by. And then you just call that inside your scroll loop function because your scroll loop function is the one that is most up to speed with where you're currently scrolling thanks to X scroll position and Y scroll position. And when you use the little scaling factor right here, like negative 0.2, negative 1.5, or 0.5, or any sort of values that that make sense for your example, you'll see that the elements you specified now are moving independently of your scroll speed at a speed that kind of matches the scroll value we specified earlier. So there you have it. You have an example that gives you the scrolling effect that we set out to create. And I know it's not the most cool example you might have seen before, but at least you learn the basics so that you can use it to create your own set of items. So the main thing I want to focus on is the performance implications of scrolling. There are many scrolling effects we'll see out there and many ways of building them. And the two things I want to call out that I kind of like about the scrolling implementation you saw in this video, there are two things. The first thing is we're never listening to the Windows scroll event. In a separate video, and I've talked about this before, the scroll event is very chatty. It gets called many times a second, far greater than how fast your screen can update. And for visual things like what we're doing, any work that goes beyond how fast your screen updates is wasted work because your screen will never show it, but you wasted CPU cycles in doing work that is basically meaningless. And we're not doing any of that stuff. We're basically only listening for the scroll event as part of scrolling. Sorry, we're never listening to the scroll event. We're only getting the scroll value as part of a request animation call, which is always pegged at how fast your screen is scrolling. And the way we're changing the position of the elements is by using Translate 3D, which pushes all of the drawing and rendering off over to your graphics card and not on your CPU, which is not a big problem for your desktops and your laptops and your more powerful machines, But on mobile devices, you're often pegged heavily on the CPU, so your GPU doing more of this work is really all you need. And so with that, if you have any questions, post in the forums at forum.crypto.com, where I or others will be happy to help you out. And if you like this, tell your friends and enemies. Everyone needs to have good, fast, parallax scrolling effects working performantly on mobile devices as well as on desktops, so everyone should know about it. Hit subscribe so you can be kept up to speed on new videos kind of like this. And also follow me at Krupa on Twitter for web development related tweets, and often a lot of tweets from science, GIFs, and a lot of funny animal videos at this point. So if you're into that kind of stuff, follow me on Krupa. And if you'd like to learn more about animations, effects like this, and more complex effects, or even more basic fundamental effects, check out my new book, Creating Web Animations, published by O'Reilly, available in paperback and Kindle editions. Alright guys, I'll see you all next time.